sitting by myself and without any external distractions. It was like, oh my gosh, who am I? What's going to happen? This is going to be weird. And I started doing a lot of solitude back in 2021. Really just doing a lot of meditating and just sitting with God. Just like, what is going on? I'm 50 years old. Just went through a really tough breakup. I've been in the same city for 50 years, and I really needed God to give me a new direction. So I just literally just started sitting with God, just sitting, just in solitude. Didn't say anything, didn't have an agenda, just sat. And I would do it for an hour or 2 hours at times. It became this amazing thing where I felt so much at peace because I was just able to sit with me and realize I was good. I was good enough. I was a good person. I had a good heart. And in that journey, I really felt like I was getting spoken to and learning about where I needed to do, where I needed to go.
Welcome to the Derelict Podcast for the disparaged, depleted, and delinquent souls trying to find our way. We're talking about the scary part of the journey where we don't know how it'll end. Let's be free to face our fucking failures in real time as the most unadulterated, truest version of who we are. No sugarcoating. Welcome to the shit show, you derelict.
What's up? It's the Derelict Podcast. If you are a man, listen up. We're speaking to you today. If you're a woman, feel free to listen in and tell your man about what we're saying today. We have an amazing guest with us today, Cory D. Simone.
Hello.
How's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Josh?
What's the English, or maybe I should say this a different way, what's the United States way of saying your last name versus the Italian way of saying your last name?
I need to correct myself because I actually I just said it the American way, which is D. Simone. I was in Italy recently, and I was actually told by somebody on a train that my actual pronunciation for my last name is De Simone.
Which would make sense.
Yeah, and I didn't know that.
The E's are usually...
Or an A.
Yeah, like a e,
yeah.
And then the E are usually, or the I's are usually E, right? Long sounding versus short sounding.
So I haven't had the heart to break it to my aunt yet that her last name when she would pronounce it was wrong. So.
It's happened to me the entire time I've been alive.
Yeah.
Where I always got it said a little wrong.
Yeah.
So it's good times. Good times. So today, we are talking about your true self. We are talking about how to actually be with your true self, which is something that, I don't know, I have a hard time doing a lot of times, and I know you've learned a lot about that as well, Cory, right?
Yeah,
Through your life.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. And we're also going to talk, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, again, this podcast is not for men. However, I do think that men kind of suck at this a lot of the times, don't you?
I would agree with that statement.
Yeah, I think that we just have a lot of, I don't know, we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording today, the limiting beliefs, the limiting mindsets, the limiting ideals, the shit that goes through our mind, right?
Yep.
Where it's like, oh man, how do I just be myself? It seems so difficult sometimes.
And how do you find comfort in just being with your true self?
Yeah, absolutely. And this podcast, as you know, and I appreciate your support and listening to several episodes as well, and we're so excited to have you on here, is all about dealing with this stuff real term, right? Like real time, not real term. What's real term? Real time. It's dealing with the failures, dealing with the struggles, just figuring out how can I actually just be myself and with myself. You know, Cory has an interesting past, and we'll bring up a little bit of it as we go along. But I'm just so excited that you're here. So one of the things that we do often on this podcast, Cory, is that we like to start off the episode sometimes with just ways that we've failed at this. Now, first, before we get there, before I even ask you a question like, how have you failed lately about being your true self? Let's define failure. Like if you were to, everyone has kind of a different answer for this. So I'm curious what your answer is. If you were to define failure in one sentence maybe or so, what would you say, what would your definition be?
Yeah, this is a great question. As I was thinking about it, the reality of it is we're all going to fail as men. I actually had a conversation with a friend yesterday who had failed. He had gotten upset with his son. He has a little 2-year-old son, and who was being a 2-year-old, and he got really frustrated with his son and kind of lashed out. Didn't do anything physically or didn't do anything to hurt the little guy. But he was feeling a lot of regret about just failing, like losing his cool because the 2-year-old was being really annoying, which 2-year-olds can tend to be that way. I mean, and so I think the thing about failure is that we're all going to experience it in our lives, but it's, when we decide not to get back up after we fall, or not to try again, I think it's when we fail.
Yeah.
I think it's really what you do with failure that determines whether you're, going to allow that to keep you down, or if you're going to live in a shame cycle, or if you're going to just try to learn from it and say, okay, this is what happened. What can I do with that? How can I get back up?
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I love that. I love that. Is there, so before I ask you to share, I'll share myself, because anytime you want to get vulnerable or jump in the pool, as I often say on this podcast, you got to get naked first, right? And that's the whole reason I'm doing this podcast, is so that I can do that.
Right.
It's really just because the listeners and the hearers want to hear or see me naked. So here we go.
I know, I'm excited for it. You didn't tell me that. You didn't tell me about that part.
It's not that kind of podcast.
Okay.
If you're watching,
All right, well,
and
good.
for you too, just so you know. So let's see. How have I failed lately regarding just being my true self? Well, I think I'll just bring up an example that I brought up to you actually with a few minutes that we were chatting right before we started recording today, and that is that I'm going on an international trip here in a few weeks, and I was somewhat nervous to kind of talk to my girlfriend about it because, I'm not going with her, I'm going with a buddy, and I'm not that I'm planning on doing anything with any other woman or anything. I just wanted to know how comfortable she was with me in that environment. And I realized that part of the way I wasn't really acting like my true self is I noticed some old kind of codependent tendencies coming up and being like, well, just find out what she wants to make sure that you do what she wants, right? And that's not being authentic with myself. It's not being authentic with my true self. It's not being authentic with, well, here's what I want out of the trip, and here's what I want to make sure happens, and then let's make sure it aligns, and let's be open and empathetic and everything to what she wants, right? But not losing myself in that, right? And, as much as I don't want to admit it, it still happens to me. It happens to me with this podcast. It happens to me with other business, with friends, etc., where I'm like, I want somebody to think of me in a certain way, and I want to make sure that I put together this narrative very specifically with kind of how I want them to think and how I then can feel, etc. Does that make sense? Ever happened to you?
Oh yeah, I think the word that comes to mind around that's just fear.
Yeah, for sure.
Fear of what people think. Fear of losing what you got, holding on to things too tight. Fear of having to deal with consequences of what you say and how that other person might respond.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good. That's good stuff. All right. So let's see. Where do we want to go from here? So I guess the first thing I was thinking about when I was thinking about this topic of just how to be your true self is I don't know if we know how to be our true self if we don't even know what our true self is, right? I mean, I guess the very first part is just figuring out who we are.
Right.
So do you have any, so just real quick, I know I didn't really give a bio about Cory, but maybe I'll just mention a couple things right now is that you've been to a few different schools in your life. You went to high school, you've gone to a couple different colleges. You just recently got back into school, right? To kind of change your career. And I don't know, can we both say that we're both going through midlife crises as far as our careers
Some would
go
call
right
it that. Some people say, oh, you're just going through a midlife crisis. I like to think of more than that, but we're both going through transitions where we're having to step through new doorways and embrace things that are difficult, things that help us to kind of question our limiting beliefs about ourselves and who we are. And so, but hopefully in both cases, it's for our better, it's for our good.
Yeah, I agree. So yeah, I definitely agree with what you're saying. And I don't feel like I'm going through a midlife crisis right now either necessarily, but when you change careers and you change complete directions of where you're going in life, I think that's just what we call it. Why do you think people call it that? Actually, just out of curiosity, do you think it makes other people feel more, I don't know, confident or understanding when they can call it something like that instead of just like he's dealing with stuff? Okay, so let's go back to kind of the point of this podcast, and I will try to make my question more clear. It's really hard for us, I would say as humans, but especially as men, to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to be ourselves. And maybe because of that, it's easier for us. I know I've done this with people as well. It's like, well, if I call it a midlife crisis or I call it some sort of major issue they're having, then I don't have to be comfortable with the discomfort that even they're feeling.
Right.
Right? Because it's almost like I feel bad for them, so I want to also call it just kind of this crisis,
Sure.
so I don't feel. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot, midlife crisis, I think always has a negative connotation. Like when you think of midlife crisis, it's like a guy once goes and buys a brand new Corvette,
Right.
or he's get a ponytail, or he gets specialized license plates, or starts dating a secretary. But I think for a lot of us, I mean, it's just
I did all those things except for the Corvette.
Right.
I got a Challenger, a Dodge Challenger when I went through mine.
I think a lot of it's just when we get led into new directions in our life, and it's not necessarily a crisis. It could be an exciting thing. It can be a fun thing, but it's still a change. And so anytime change happens, most of us kind of change is hard. So I think when we go through any kind of a change, people could think of it as a crisis, but in my mind, it could be a positive thing, not just the negative connotation of midlife crisis is something's wrong with that person, or they're trying to relive their childhood, or they're grasping for some purpose in reality, when reality just might be that they're being led in a new direction. And that could be a really cool thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So back to kind of what we were talking about finding our true selves. And maybe that's a part of the whole midlife crisis thing, at least it's been for me, right? With starting this podcast and new business and everything else, is that I just got to a point where I was like, how do I want to live the next 10 years of my life? How do I want to live the next 20, 30 years of my life? And am I really listening to the passions and the vision and who I am? Right? Or am I just doing what I'm doing because I'm good at it? I've done it for a long time. I've built up good credibility with it, etc. And honestly, changing it is scary, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like you're going from a very specific career that you're in to something wildly different.
Yeah, it's like I'm walking on water these days.
Yeah. So back to the question about kind of how we find out who we are, what our true inner self is, or our just who we are. What has helped you in that? What has helped you kind of figure out this really aligns more with who I am? Any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to, realizing that my identity is not in externals. It's not my job, it's not who I'm dating, it's not how good I am at running, or these other things, how I look outside with people, carry on conversations. It's about internals. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, it's a lot of it has to do with my faith, and just kind of who I am as a person inside, and even in my failures and weaknesses, knowing that I'm loved, and just and really grabbing onto those things that are in me that I feel good about, that are intrinsic qualities that you can't put a price on.
Yeah.
How I treat people, how I treat myself, and try to help others and be kind. Those are things that I feel like I think where you find your true identity, your true self in, that you can take with you, and you can have when you're with people, or you can have by yourself. So if you're alone, you can still embrace those qualities, because they're not built upon a facade of a false self.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're bringing up a really good point too about kind of being by yourself and feeling comfortable with that. And I know that something that I've definitely struggled with when I've been on this journey. I've been on this kind of intense journey the last 6 years or so, trying to figure out who I am. And part of that journey we've gotten introduced through that journey because we've both been trying to figure out. We've been part of groups before where we're trying to figure out who we are and trying to get back in touch with our inner self as well. And I know for me, coming from a place of having some codependent tendencies and being in a very long-term committed marriage for a very long time, and when all those things started kind of falling apart, I had a hard time, and still do at times, being alone with myself, because it's kind of the classic, somebody's life falls apart, so they leave town, right, and they go to some other city. But guess what happens?
Right.
You follow yourself, right?
Right.
You can't get away from yourself.
Yeah.
And you had a move a few years ago where the same thing happened, right? And you get away from yourself. You might be able to get away from all those triggering memories when you're there, but you still can't get away from yourself. Yeah. And I read this a little while ago, and I thought this would be a good thing for us to talk about. And I wish I could give a quote here. Whoever said this, if you listen, please let me know, and I'm more than willing to come back and give you credit for this quote because I don't know where it came from. But basically what they said was they were talking about isolation versus solitude. And the way I've thought about it in the past is if I am isolating, I usually isolate because I don't want to be around people. I don't want to be held accountable for my actions. I just want to go live my addictive fantasies of whatever. Right? Versus solitude, I'm usually trying to get away, get with myself, get with God, get with whoever, right? Like whatever your thing is, in order to better understand myself. And this is what they said. They said that isolation is self-protection from society, and solitude is preparation for society. And I thought that was really, really good.
I love that. I think that's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, for when I think about isolation, it's like you're just wanting to numb out. Really, you don't want to show up for life, and you want to just be by yourself and not have to be in relationships and deal with people. And it's just an unhealthy lifestyle. It's an unhealthy way to live. But I think we all go through those periods of time where we just don't want to deal with life.
Yeah, absolutely.
So isolating is just a normal human response to that. We're all that way. If left to our own devices, we all probably would default to isolating. Whereas solitude is like, it's like choosing mindfulness to be present with your feelings and emotions. It's like a friend has shared with me that, when you can just sit with your feelings in solitude and allow yourself to feel, which I think a lot of the time we avoid that when we're isolating. When you can sit with your feelings and just be okay with that and know that you're going to be all right, I think there's real power in that.
So would you call that solitude?
Yeah.
More so than isolation?
Choosing to be in solitude where you're like, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm going through. I'm choosing to sit with that. I'm choosing to realize that I'm safe, I'm okay, nothing can hurt me. But I'm choosing to be present with myself to the next thing that happens. So,
what would you say to people that maybe have a hard time, like me, like I just shared with you, having those solitude moments? For like at least for myself, it was hard for me to even prioritize that, first of all, to actually even have any sort of solitude. I remember when I first started going through this, what I started doing is I would rent a cabin or Airbnb, preferably one with no internet access, and I would go there for a couple days. And I understand not everybody can do this, but I would go there for a couple days just to try to be as silent as possible, turn my phone off. And I remember the very first time that I did this and I turned my phone off for 2 days, it was like excruciating. It was so difficult for me to feel disconnected for just a couple days.
Yeah.
And I knew my kids were taken care of.
Yeah.
I knew all my friends and family would be fine. Like the whole world doesn't end if I disappear for a couple days. But it's so hard. Why do you think that is? What do you think there? I mean, have you experienced that before?
Yeah, I think part of it is we're wired for connection.
It's true.
I think there's a part of us that we're meant to be with other people. So I think when we choose purposely to separate ourselves from other people, that's going to be uncomfortable just because we're social creatures.
Yeah.
So I think that makes it hard. And I think it strips us of everything. When we take off and we're in isolation, we strip all the distractions away, the phone, the TV, and we just sit with ourselves. It really puts us in an uncomfortable space because we have to be with ourselves. We have to be with our own thoughts. We have to deal with who we are, our perceptions of who we are, and not anything else. So it really puts us in a vulnerable spot where it's like, who am I? Am I okay with just me? And I think it's important to have those times because I think we come out of that stronger, that we realize that we're okay, we're good, that who we are at our core is a good person, and at the very least, we're trying to become a good person. And so I think, just to answer your question, we're social creatures, and I think when we're alone in isolation and solitude, it's a challenge, for us. So
I think for me too, I can be extreme at times, and I think for me sometimes it's like, well, I either need to have 1,000 people around me right now, or I need to be a monk.
Yeah. Yeah, and and the thing about that, even though, it's like I was just thinking about that. It's like there have been times where I've been like in a room full of friends and people that care about me, and I can think of 30 to 40 people off the top of my head that I could talk to today if I needed to. But it's an inside job, for us. So you can be in a room of 1,000 friends and still feel completely alone. Again, that's going back to the false self. If our value is in what people think of us and our external relationships, or you can be by yourself in a cabin in the middle of the woods and feel completely in peace and solitude.
Yeah, it's so true.
So it's so interesting how we can't depend on getting those feelings from others and and externals. It's about being at peace with ourselves, and I think it takes practice. I don't think anybody's just going to be like, oh, I'm going to just go spend a week in solitude in the cabin. That's going to be easy. It's going to be hard.
Yeah.
I mean, I would tell most people maybe take a couple hours, and be in solitude and just kind of work up from there, because I do think that's how you can get stronger and you can grow in those journeys.
I think that's a really good point too. And one of the last guests actually we had in the podcast said almost the exact same thing that you said. And they were talking about how isolation or feeling isolated doesn't mean you have to be alone.
Right.
You could be in a crowd. You could go to a concert and there's 30, 50, 100,000 people there and still feel completely alone, right? And then like you said, you could go be by yourself in a cabin or just by yourself wherever and just feel not alone.
So true.
Feel like you're with your higher power, you're with God, you're with the universe, you're feeling like, you're really with your true self, etc. That is so accurate. I think you're bringing up bringing up a good point too, where for the listeners or the viewers out there, one thing that I would encourage you to do as well is the same thing that Cory is saying, and that is take it small. Don't feel like this has to be some extreme thing where you sell everything and go live as a monk for the next 30 years of your life. Like, you don't have to do that.
Right.
How about just get off your phone for a half an hour when you're spending time with somebody? Yeah. Like, we have computers in front of us, cameras, microphones, everything else. Yeah, so we have screens, obviously, but I'm trying to be as present with you as possible. And I think that we've lost a lot of that in society, right? Like, we've talked about this before. My favorite show of all time is Seinfeld. Okay. And I know one of your favorite shows of all time is MASH. And one of the things that both of those have in common is that they were both pre-cell phone. Right? So maybe at the end of Seinfeld, they started getting like a cell phone or whatever, but they're pre-cell phone, meaning that when people went and hung out, they actually just hung out.
Right.
Like people would sit around. Like when was the last time, if you're watching this, when was the last time you went somewhere to go meet with somebody and you just sat there? Yeah. Like you didn't get on your phone to see if they're still showing up. You didn't get on your phone to see what was happening on social media. You just sat there. Like this morning, I had an example. I think I already told you. I ran out of coffee, and I woke up this morning to no coffee, which for me is not a good thing. I know it's a first world problem, but it's one of my first world problems I'm okay with. It's one of my addictions I'm okay with. So I decided, okay, I got to go to the coffee shop, and I decided to get myself a nice coffee and then also grab a bag of beans. And when I was waiting for them to make the coffee, I sat there at a table with everybody else was on their phones and computers and everything else. And I just sat there and I just looked around and I could tell I was here and somebody was kind of right next to me, kind of like we are right here, but at a different table. There's maybe another foot in between us. Yeah. And I could tell that person was uncomfortable that I was just sitting there. They're like, maybe it was just in my own head, but I have a feeling in their head, they're like, what the fuck is that guy doing? Why is he just sitting there? Because it seems so odd now, right? Where we just don't know how to, maybe I shouldn't speak for everybody. I have a hard time with it. I'm like, how do I just sit here?
Yeah, it's amazing. I go into places and it's like, everybody's on their cell phones. And it's like everybody's in that place where they're distracted from themselves. Mm-hmm. And I even struggle with it too. It's like the cell phone is probably the biggest culprit, I think, for a lot of us. And I remember the days of like just, wanting to talk to a friend or something. I'd call them on the phone because we didn't have cell phones. We had the old phones, the kind that you had to like dial up and, and try to get some privacy from your family.
Or remember the time when you were meeting somebody and you would go meet somebody somewhere, but you have no way of contacting them. Like if you get there early, you get there late, you hit traffic, you're like, well, hope they stay there.
Yeah, we just, social media, and I think the ideas behind it were like to bring people closer, but I think in so many ways it's made us more isolated because we don't talk anymore. We don't communicate like we're doing right now. We don't have those more genuine interactions where we can see who we're talking to, or at the very least listen to them. Even a phone call can be really helpful as opposed to just texting or just looking at somebody's social media post. I think we've definitely lost that in our culture in a lot of respects. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. So what do you think is the answer there? So one of the answers that I heard from you already, which I thought was a really good one, is take it small,
Yeah.
right? Just like spend an hour without your phone or half hour, a couple hours, whatever it is. One thing that I, kind of said earlier, and I would still encourage people to do, let me be more specific with this. If you're listening or watching this right now, here's what I'd recommend you do. The next time you're going to meet with somebody or some buddies, doesn't matter, get there early and sit there and see how difficult it is for you. Just sit there. Just sit at a table. No phone. You cannot look at your phone. You cannot look at your computer. You cannot look at any screen. Just sit there and just try it for like 15 minutes. The whole world is not going to end if you're off of social media for 15 minutes, right? Even if you're an influencer, right? Just try that. Is there anything else that you would tell people that you have found helpful in sitting in solitude? I know that you've developed a lot of your solitude practices over the last couple of years. Would you like to talk about any of those that have been helpful?
Yeah, sure. Really for me, solitude was always something that I struggled with because, again, just sitting by myself and without any external distractions, it was like, oh my gosh, who am I? What's going to happen? This is going to be weird. And I started doing a lot of solitude back in 2021, to really just doing a lot of meditating and just sitting with God, just like, what is going on? I'm 50 years old. Just went through a really tough breakup. I've been in the same city for 50 years, and I really needed God to give me a new direction. So I just literally just started sitting with God, just sitting, just in solitude. Didn't say anything, didn't have an agenda, just sat. And I would do it for an hour or 2 hours at times. And it became this amazing thing where I felt so much at peace because I was just able to sit with me and realize I was good. I was good enough. I was a good person. I had a good heart, and in that journey, I really felt like I was getting spoken to and learning about where I needed to do, where I needed to go, and it's something I've continued on. Where sometimes I'll just sit in quiet stillness and not try to. And I would say I would encourage people to maybe take like 10 minutes and just take 10 minutes a day and just sit in quiet and peace. And don't have an agenda. Don't try to figure out what's going to happen. Just let things happen. And just, and then just see how that's helping you, and then continue to try to develop more and more of it. Because I think we need that. I think we need to learn how to be okay with ourselves. And we need to learn how to be with our true self and just be. And know that's okay. Know you're enough. You're enough of a person. You're lovable. You're created in the image of God, who you are. You don't need to change. You don't need to be a different person than how you're created. But I think a lot of us never slow down enough to really even figure out what that looks like. So, yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or not before, but I definitely have not told the viewers this yet. So I went to this, I almost said all-inclusive. It's definitely not all-inclusive, but like an intensive week-long therapy thing this once, where basically I went to this therapeutic office and then pretty much all day saw different therapists that were touching on different things about my life, and I did it for an entire week. It wasn't like an intensive. It wasn't like I was checked in or something like that. But it was just I rented an Airbnb, and then I went there all day, did therapy, came back exhausted, did it again for 5 days. And it was really intense, as you can probably imagine. Yeah. I think I did probably, I don't know, a quarter to a half a year of therapy in a week. It was insane. But here's the only reason I'm bringing up that story. The main person there that was in charge of it, the main thing she had to say to me, she said, the thing I think you need more than anything else is that you need to spend some time to date yourself. And to me, that's what solitude has become. And that's what you're talking about, right? So obviously we have listeners that believe in God, that don't believe in God. We have listeners that believe in themselves, believe in the universe, believe in higher power. Doesn't matter. Don't get stuck on the fact that Cory's saying God. It's God for Cory. That's great. But what I think is really important is whatever that is for you, have you learned how to just be comfortable with yourself, just to date yourself, just to learn more about yourself? Because I know you would think that we would know ourselves better than anybody else, but all of our fucking head trash and everything, right? And when was the last time that you got to know yourself? Right. When was the last time that you sat down and just spent time with yourself and just let the thoughts go, and maybe you wrote, maybe you did a painting, maybe you meditated, maybe you read some sort of scripture, other religious text, maybe, I don't know, fill in the blank.
Right.
Some sort of guided meditation.
Right.
There's a lot of things people could do. People do it through yoga, etc. But when was the last time that you did that just to learn about yourself? Just to date with yourself with no other agenda besides I'm going to sit down. And that's one of the things that I really respect and appreciate about you, Cory, that you've told me about before. Even you saying, like, sitting with myself for an hour or two freaks me out. It really does.
Yeah.
And I've done it before, but it's still like, even that thought, I'm like, I don't know if I could spend that much time with myself,
Right.
which probably speaks to, I don't know, some insecurities and maybe some things that I need to learn about,
Yeah,
right?
I think we all, I appreciate that too. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's not easy. I mean, I don't think anybody naturally just like wants to sit in solitude themselves. Well,
My really good buddy's really introverted.
that's-
And I literally asked him the other day, I was like, do you ever like just want to talk to somebody more often than you do? And he's like, no, never. So maybe for him.
he's identifying himself. That's good. And I think also like solitude can be in nature too. You know, we can be out, and solitude can be, honestly, you could be out going out. You could go out and just do things by yourself. You don't have to be in a quiet environment. You can be out in the public. You can be doing things and just be present with yourself.
Yeah.
You could be out shopping or going to get dinner or going to a movie and just be present with yourself. And it doesn't have to be quiet, but you're, you know, in some respects, when you're in a public place by yourself, it can almost be more difficult.
Yeah.
Because when you're in a public place and you're by yourself and you feel that sense of I'm just with me.
Yeah.
And you're not trying to gravitate to somebody else or trying to connect with somebody else or, you know, meet somebody or maybe hit on somebody. You're just like, I'm here dating myself, spending time in my own solitude, even though I'm around people, and I'm going to embrace that.
Yeah.
And then it creates this sense of self-love in yourself and self-worth that is really helpful, because then you kind of get out of the rat race where you're not trying to fit in, you're not trying to put on a false front, you're not trying to be cool, you're just being. And you can be with yourself in public or in private. So
I think that's really good too. And so back to my example before, if you're going to meet somebody for coffee and I just want you to sit there for 15 minutes, I think what could be even more difficult than that, to your point, is just what if you're just out in public and decide to do it? And there's no end time. Yeah. That can be scary too, of like, well, I'm just going to walk around without staring at my phone the whole time like that. That could petrify a lot of people, given how addicted we are to our phones and everything else, which is a whole another podcast episode, right? But I think that that's a really good point. And so maybe with what you just said, I thought that was a brilliant example. And maybe, again, just for the listeners and viewers, one thing I would recommend you do is, again, take it in small chunks, right? Like, go be in public for 15 minutes by yourself and say, hey, I'm going to even set an alarm on your phone, your watch, whatever. Yeah. Like, I'm going to take the next 15 minutes and not look at anything. And until it vibrates or rings or anything else, then I'll do it. And just start small.
Yeah, and I think it's hard because I think a lot of people have been so conditioned to try to fit into the world, what the world says they are. And they have this idea that they have to strive or pursue or try to attain something to some kind of status, because, you know, people struggle with just being with themselves and accepting themselves and just being okay with that, you know, and loving themselves for who they are today. And I think people just have a hard time with just like being. And so but when we start to do that and we realize that, hey, we're good, you know, we're not perfect, you know, we make mistakes, but, you know, for most of us, we have a good soul and a good at our core, and then we can tap into that. It's like, you know what, I'm a good person. I'm kind. I care about humanity, and I'm enough. I think when people, that's one of the things I started to learn about when I started doing more meditation and solitude practices, is I realized, hey, I'm enough. I'm safe. I'm good. You know, I don't have to try to measure up or be, you know, something for somebody. It kind of frees you. And it takes you out of that rat race. And I think a lot of it too is culture. Culture really promotes this idea of we have to achieve, we have to attain, we have to look a certain way, we have to have this status, you know, and that's a kind of a rat race you can't win. And so I think when we can step back from that a little bit and just allow ourselves to be who God created us to be, you know, and to embrace that in a healthy way, I think we're better for it.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I would even use stronger language. I don't think it's kinda. I think it is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that is.
Yeah.
You know, when we were born, we weren't born for technology. Right? It's kind of that old phrase of use technology, don't let technology use you. And it just seems like the more technology advances, the more we just kind of sit back and let let it use us at times. And I'm not calling out anybody else because I'm doing it myself. I mean, we're literally using a bunch of technology right now. These clips will be on social media.
Right.
And yet we're dogging all this stuff, but that's how you get followers and people listening, and hopefully we can help people with that.
Well, I think the beautiful thing about this, Josh, is that we're trying to help people. I think because I think so many people are struggling with identity, who they are, being okay with themselves, realizing that they're enough. And it's like you're in a losing battle because everything that's being shown to you and what's bombarding you is the opposite of that. And so I think hopefully people can gain some perspective about who they are and that they're enough and that they can be okay with themselves. But yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, everything in our world today is it's so immediate. It's fast forward. It's fast food. It's the 20-minute sitcom. Everything's fixed in 20 minutes. So, and life isn't like that. So we need to be able to be okay with ourselves, that when we fail or struggle or have a hard time, it's like we can be okay with ourselves and just continue to move forward.
Yeah, another example that I was just talking about with my girlfriend this morning was we went to a trip to an island at the beginning of the year. And I don't know if you've ever heard the term island time before, but for anybody that's listening, if you live on an island, you know what I'm talking about. If you've never visited an island, let me just explain it real quick. Island time is often referred to when you go to an island, because a lot of the times people that live on islands they just work at a different timeline than a lot of people that are working in cities and everything else. It's like, we'll get to it when we get to it. Like fast food will take an hour, right? Like it's island time. Like it doesn't mean we're actually meeting at 5 o'clock. We'll meet somewhere between 5 and 7. Like it'll happen, right? Yeah. And I've experienced that with every island I've ever visited. So if you are listening from an island and you don't have island time, feel free to send me a note and say, we don't have island time. That's fine. But I've heard it from every other person. Yeah. And the only reason I'm even bringing that up is that when I experience island time, it really forces me to be with myself in a way that's somewhat uncomfortable, because I'm so used to doing and accomplishing and what's the next thing and et cetera, versus maybe I just need to sit here and wait for my food for an hour and just be with myself. Now, I know we talked about this earlier, and I know that this podcast, obviously there's men and women that listen to this podcast, but I want to speak specifically to men for a second, because we're two men, or some would say, at least for me. You're a man. I'm a man.
I think so. Yeah.
Who knows with gender fluidity and all that jazz right now. But we're both men. We both identify as men. We're both gender men. We're both biologically men. Anyway, enough on that topic before I get canceled for this podcast. As men, that was a very long-winded way of me actually asking my question. Do you think that there are specific or unique challenges? And let's maybe just focus, we live in the United States of America, so I know not every country is the same. But do you think that there's specific reasons why it's hard for us as men to just be ourselves, to be with ourselves, to be our true identity? Do you feel like there's specific, I don't know, societal pressures or other things that make it really difficult just as men?
I think so. I mean, I think a lot of our models, at least for me growing up, I mean, my first, when I was a kid, I wanted to be the Fonz, because I thought he was the coolest thing ever. And
Happy Days, love it.
Happy Days, man. I grew up on that, and the Fonz was like my hero, and I thought he was the definition of macho and self-sufficient and what a male is supposed to be. And then I saw him a couple years later in the movie, and he was a total geek. And I was so disappointed. I was like, "Oh my gosh,
no, the Fonz,
the nerd." But I think that kind of message, growing up, at least for me, was like, you have to be strong, you have to be self-sufficient, you can't show weakness. And unfortunately, for most of us, we have those messages coming from us externally, but internally, we're experiencing things that are the opposite. That we feel shame, we feel isolation, we feel loneliness, we feel embarrassment for different things that we're going through growing up as a kid that we had no control over. So I think we have these conflicting messages about who society says we're supposed to be, but what's our experience? And so I think that's a huge challenge. And I think especially for men and probably for women to a certain extent too, I would imagine. But I know for men, just the roles that we're kind of put into and how we're supposed to be can be pretty daunting. And then that comes back to just learning how to love yourself and be okay with who you are, and realizing that, we all have experienced trauma and things we've gone through that affect how we view ourselves and how we view the world. So being able to be okay with where we're at, and then taking steps to try to become healthier and giving ourselves a lot of grace when we fall down. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned this as well. It feels, at least to me, and we've had some similar conversations on this podcast about this as well, but it feels to me like there's an element of society that says it's okay more for a woman to feel those things or to, I don't know, be more vulnerable in some of those areas. Like that's okay. It's more expected, maybe more okay. And there are these kind of societal roles for men where it's not okay for us, right? Like we got to have our shit together. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen for women. I'm just saying specifically for men, it seems like that there's some of that stuff in society. What do you think about
I agree.
that?
I mean, I think that's how we're raised. I mean, I think it's changing to some degree with how women view themselves, and a lot of times they have to be more self-sufficient because of their experiences, and they have to be stronger, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think in general, I mean, it's just been this perception of how men are supposed to be and how women are supposed to be, and in an ideal situation, right? That might be okay, but we don't live in an ideal situation. We didn't grow up in ideal situations, and how we were raised or what the experiences we went through, and so I think it's really challenging to be able to see yourself as a human being and not as a man or a woman, and just like I'm a part of the human race, and be able to be okay with that when you feel weak or you feel like you're not enough, and not to shame yourself but to love yourself and to say, okay, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm going through. I can sit with that. I can journal that. I can do different practices to try to be okay with that, because for most of us, we had experiences growing up that affected us that we had no control over. So it's like we're given these gifts, so to speak, of our experiences growing up, and then we're just supposed to deal with it. And for a lot of us, we don't know how. So it's trying to just have gentleness with ourselves to realize, okay, I'm trying to figure this stuff out. I'm not going to do it perfect. I'm going to continue to move forward and try to be healthy and try to be the best person I can be. But it's not the normal type of stuff you go through.
Yeah,
for sure.
Agreed. And I know we've talked about this in the past, but one of the things one of my mentors says often to me is he says, just remember, every emotion is temporary, right?
I love that.
And it's hard for me. So we did an episode before. If you haven't listened to it, go listen to the one on staying present. Because one of the things that we talk, and staying emotionally present, I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I should know the name of my own podcast, but it's staying emotionally present. You'll find it. And one of the things that we talk about in there is that there aren't any bad emotions, right? But there are some that for me are more difficult for me to experience or harder for me to experience, right? Like it's harder for me to experience anger or resentment or fear or anxiety than it is for me to experience joy and happiness, right? And go down the list. However, that phrase and that quote always reminds me that when one of these emotions feels like it's just washing over me, you've had that experience before, I'm guessing?
Oh, yeah.
When it feels like I just can't get out of this emotion, this fear, this anxiety, this resentment, whatever it is, what I try to remind myself that has helped me in those times is just realize it's like a wave. It's going to go away.
Yep.
If you're sitting on the beach, the waves don't just keep coming forever. Right. And if they do, you probably should run for the hills because they do
Seen
sometimes.
that movie.
But it still doesn't come forever. It still goes away.
Right.
It might be bigger than normal, but it still goes away. Right. And that's how I think of emotions. Like it might feel like this tidal wave coming towards me. It might also just feel like a little ripple. But whatever it is, the wave is going away. It's not going to be around forever. But what I've found is that if I ignore it, or I fight it, or I minimize it, or I deny it, the wave just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger till it is this tidal wave that feels like I'm going to die. Right? Versus I'm feeling some discomfort right now. I'm feeling some anger right now. Where's that coming from? Where do I feel it in my body? Why do I feel it? What's going on in my life right now? Do I need to write about this? Do I need to call a friend? Do I need to listen to a podcast episode about this? What do I need to do? Do I need to meditate? Do I need to pray? Right? And, oh man, that's so hard for me though.
I think it's hard for all of us. You're
not going to be on here saying you got it all figured out.
No, I've experienced that. And that's something I've worked on too. Is I think, and like you mentioned, I mean, feelings they're gonna pass. Feelings are just feelings, and I think one of the things I've learned is that when I'm having a negative feeling is to almost like give honor to it. If I'm having an uncomfortable feeling, I'm like, give it credit. Like, there's a reason you're feeling that. Don't see the feeling as a bad thing. Okay, there's a reason I'm having this feeling. Give it credibility. Sit with it, and then realize that, it can't hurt you. A feeling is just a feeling. It'll pass. At least that's been my experience. I've never had a negative feeling come and then stay forever. It always seems to move. I always seem to move through it. But like you said so eloquently, is that, if you don't allow yourself to feel that feeling, sit with it, then it's just going to continue. And it's going to continue to kind of happen. But if you can just sit with it and realize, okay, maybe I'm sitting in my house and it's like 2 p.m. I'm feeling this feeling. Am I safe? Can anything hurt me right now? And you also mentioned too that it goes along with this is being present. If you can be present with that feeling right in that moment and realize that nothing can hurt me, I'm safe. I'm in a place that's affirming. I'm in a place that's comfortable. When you can do that and just sit with that feeling and give it honor the good feelings and the bad feelings. And like you said, why is this feeling coming up, and acknowledge that. And when you can kind of do that, in my experience, is it tends to just kind of work through and kind of goes away, and then all of a sudden you're kind of there and you realize it feels better, as opposed to like getting pulled into that and getting sucked into that loop, which when that happens, then it's just like becomes a cycle. So I think it's really important to understand that all feelings are valid, and if we can just be okay with that and realize it can't hurt us, then I think it's gonna help you a lot.
You said something that I think is really, really key too, just that I want to reiterate for everybody listening or watching right now, or watching and listening. And that is that these emotions are not your enemy.
Right.
Like no emotions are, right? Like
Right.
You would say that still about anger, fear, resentment, the ones that are more difficult, they're still not your enemy.
Right.
And if you can be friends with these emotions, for myself, this is going to sound maybe a little woo-woo to some people, but for myself, one thing that I have found to be really helpful, realizing that these friends are emotions and then trying to become friends with them and trying to figure out what is this emotion trying to teach me?
Right.
Like if I'm fearful right now, what inside of me is fearful, and what is it trying to teach me? What is it trying to help me with? Because I've found that I have these parts inside of me that are trying to help me do things, and sometimes they're misdirected, right? So sometimes they're like, well, I'm going to make you feel anxiety here, when in reality, well, why are they making me feel anxiety? Because they don't want me to be hurt in some way, let's say.
Right.
And because they don't want me to be hurt, they want me to feel anxious about the thing that could hurt me so that I don't do it, so that I'm not hurt.
Yeah.
But the hurt might actually be good for me. And if I just redirect that to, okay, instead of anxiety, let me think through this, like you said, right? Like, let me think through the whole thing. Like, what's the worst that could happen?
Right.
If the worst thing happens, is it really going to be that bad?
Right.
That's another question. Because I don't know about you, man, but I, in my own head, build up these scenarios that never fucking happen, that I always think are just going to be like the end of the world for me. And then they're not. And then I get through the emotion. I'm like, oh, somehow I survived that one too.
I think a lot of us do that. We awfulize things. We worst case, at least I do.
Awfulize.
Awfulize.
That's such a good word.
Worst case scenario situations, and in my mind, I can go 3 or 4 steps ahead about something, and then it almost never happens like that.
Right.
It's always something that I've made up in my mind to be so much worse than it actually is. And I think part of that too is when those things happen, if we can just be present in our body, be present what we're feeling, acknowledge what we're feeling, be curious about what we're feeling, it kind of takes that mystiqueness of fear away. We can, oh yeah, I'm having this feeling, okay. And not see it as a bad thing. See it as there's a reason I'm having this feeling. There's a benefit to it if I can just see it that way rather than a bad thing. Oh, this is interesting. Almost like metacognition. And you step away. It's like you're thinking about thinking. It's like rather than just thinking about rather than just having a thought, you're actually thinking about the thought you're having. So you're actually stepping away from the feeling of the thought and kind of giving yourself a little space. And it doesn't feel so scary because you're actually analyzing it. And it's, oh, okay, interesting. Whereas opposed to it's like the example I always would use. It's the difference between if you're at the coast and you're, I like to go to the coast sometimes to listen to the storm or the weather or the rain or the wind. And, one of the things I like just listening to it. Like I'll have the window open and I'll be reading and I can hear the ocean crashing. I can hear the wind and the waves and the stormy weather. I think it's really kind of comforting. It's the difference between sitting in your hotel room and listening to the sound of the waves crashing, the rain, the wind. It's the difference between sitting there and then going outside and standing in it. It's like when you so something I used to do is I would get in the middle of the feeling. I'd go jump in the middle of the storm, like this, and get right into the feeling. And what I've learned to do now is I can take a step back and just be aware of the feeling. I'm noticing that feeling. I'm noticing this what I'm going through, and it made a big difference for me because all of a sudden I wasn't pulled into it. I was able to have more of a metacognitive approach to it, thinking about that rather than being sucked into it. So I think those are things that are super helpful.
That's a really, really good point. You said a lot of really good things there. Number one, what you said that I loved is awfulize. I've never heard that word before. I want to start using that word, awfulize.
You can
I love that. Yeah, can I steal that from you?
You sure can.
That'd be great.
Wasn't original for me, so
okay.
I stole from somebody else too.
Yeah,
so.
well, we'll give credit. Whoever said awfulize first, congratulations. There's your credit.
There you go.
So awfulizing things, I think that's really good. And with that, one other thing that I'm taking away from what you're saying too is just jump into that emotion and realize it's not. So here's the other thing. When you've awfulized these things, or when I've awfulized these things, and we think it's going to be the end of the world, etc., we're still here.
Right.
It didn't kill us.
Right.
You're not dead.
Right.
Unless you're a ghost.
It's just a feeling.
That'd be weird.
It's just a feeling.
Yeah, it's just a feeling. Neither one of us, we've all survived. Yeah. Both of us have. Everyone listening to this, if you're listening to this, you survived as well.
Yeah.
So why does our brain keep thinking or trying to convince us, oh, you're not going to survive this time? Yeah, really?
Yeah.
Because you did before. And maybe, like you said, maybe you just need to embrace that emotion instead of punching it away, getting rid of it, saying, no, I don't ever want to feel anger ever again in my life. Why don't you just embrace the anger, realize that you're having it, and then, like you said, it's almost like a third part. It's almost like you're viewing like a medical experiment, right? Like, I wonder what's happening over there with that guy. And it's you, right? But I wonder what's happening over there with that guy and that anger. Because I notice when I can do that and I can step outside of myself, oh man, it's so much better.
Yeah. It's like giving yourself a little, like a 2-second window to kind of be aware. Mm-hmm. The more you can be aware of feelings and emotions, the less you get sucked into them. Mm-hmm. I'm having this feeling right now. You're aware of the feeling, but it doesn't become you. And I think that's super helpful.
It is.
It's been for me.
Really helpful. And it's the same thing that I try to do with my kids as well. And if it's somebody else having an emotion, it's easier, right? It's easier for us to be like, they're having that emotion. And it's easier for me, like if you called me and you're really angry about something and you want to vent to me about something, it's easier for me to have a third-party view because it's not my anger.
Right.
I can already be away from it.
Right.
It's harder for me to do that if it's my own.
Yeah.
And for me to even literally take my own advice, maybe that I just gave you or vice versa, right?
Yeah, because we get so caught up in our heads. I mean, that's the thing is we get caught up in our head, and then we go into these cycles of thoughts. So when we can step away from that by having some of these metacognitive approaches, it makes a huge difference, and it just gives us some grace to just love ourselves and to not have to feel like we have to have it all figured out. Yeah, for sure. Agreed. Yeah. Well, thanks for being here. As we're wrapping up, what are there any? I don't know. Are there any takeaways besides, obviously we already said a lot in this episode, but are there any big takeaways that you want to leave with people? If somebody's listening and they're thinking, oh man, I have a hard time being with myself. I have a hard time with solitude. I don't really feel comfortable with myself. And by the way, if you're saying that you do feel comfortable with yourself, you're fucking full of shit. Like don't pull that shit here. Like go listen to another podcast that's all about, oh, look at how successful we are and we never have any problems. Go listen to that podcast. There's 8 million of them. Yeah. If you're going to be here, don't do that here because it's bullshit. All of us are insecure with ourselves at times. All of us have these rough emotions. All of these have these feelings where we're feeling like an imposter, we're feeling like a loser or whatever. And for the people that are listening right now that maybe are just having a hard time, just like, how do I just be secure with myself and then dig into it? Is there anything else that you'd like to say to them? Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me, just speaking off of my experiences, I think, just learning to love yourself, and to realize that you are enough, finding things about yourself that you value and that you feel good about, realizing that the value of who you are is not in externals, get away from what you do for a living, get away from who you're with, get away from like how good you look at the gym. I would say if you focus on those things, you're going to struggle because you're always going to be in comparison mode. If you can find it within yourselves to find out who you are, and just be okay with that and realize that you're enough and that you have good qualities and that you have, as a human being, you have love, and that's something God has given us love to have for ourselves and for others. If you can tap into that, then you can be with yourself, and you can get out of that rat race of trying to like measure up to other people. Because the reality is, one thing I've learned is that when I compare myself to people's outsides, I'm always comparing that to my insides.
Yeah.
And I always lose.
Good point.
So if you can get away from that and I think you do that by getting out of your externals and getting into yourself and finding value in who you are, then all of a sudden other stuff isn't so important anymore, because you're becoming who you are, and then you start to feel like, hey, I love who I am because I'm a human being. And I think that's where I would start. That's what I had to start doing, is get away from trying to measure up and compare to other people.
You know what? You're bringing up a really good point too. I love what you just said there. And when you're comparing yourself to somebody else's outsides, you're comparing them to your insides, right? That's how you said it.
I wish I would have come up with that. That wasn't my original thought.
It's okay.
So good.
It's okay. I love it because there is absolutely no way for me to compare my insides with your insides, because I don't know what your insides are.
Right.
You can tell me what they are, but I don't actually know what they are.
But even if I tell you, you're gonna think better of it than
for sure.
Yeah.
100%.
So it's a one down process. You're always going to be one down.
100%. And the comparison game is you're always going to lose.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be somebody richer, funnier, smarter, whatever.
So don't do it. Don't do it.
Yeah.
That's a start right there.
Yeah.
Try to avoid that if you can. So.
Yeah. And to your point, also just find so everyone that's listening right now, here's a quick homework thing for yourself. Just write down 5 things that you like about yourself. Just it. That's it. Yeah. Maybe it's your nose. Like, I don't care what it is.
Mine's too big.
It could be your it could be your eyes, it could be your hair, it could be your nose, it could be the fact that you're kind, whatever. Do that. Yeah. And here's another thing that, again, another one of my mentors says to me often. He says, when you get inside, when you're in your own head too much and you're on this path of just the shit that's going on in there, he said one of the quickest, most efficient ways of getting out of that is to go find somebody to serve.
I love that. I agree.
And I love that too.
Yeah.
And serve could be very simple. Let me give you a very, very simple example of serving. Also happened to me at the coffee shop this morning. I was in a good mood. I was in the coffee shop. I'm waiting for my coffee. So I'm there at the counter and I just chat with the lady that's making coffee. I smile at her. I engage with her. I was present with her. I listened to what she said. And I don't always do that. Trust me. More often than not, like, don't think I'm trying to give myself credit right here. More often than not, I don't. I'm just like on my phone telling everybody to go fuck themselves because I'm way more important than everybody else in the coffee shop. So like, don't give me credit for this. Yeah. I'm just saying what I noticed though is that eye to eye, cell phone's not there, chatting with her, and then guess what? She opened up. Yep. She was friendly. She was nice. I could see her whole countenance changing, and that was it. Yeah. That was me serving her. Serving does not have to be. If you're listening to this and you're like, oh my God, I got to go like to Africa and feed hungry children. That's not what we mean when we're saying serve people. It could be as simple as a smile, a laugh, a call, a text, like just something to tell people like, hey, love you, man. Agreed. Just wanted to let you know that.
Yeah, connection.
Just a small piece of connection. Yep. That's awesome.
Agreed.
That's awesome. Anything else?
That's it. I really appreciate you having me on. It's been really a fun experience.
Thank you for being on.
Yeah, it's cool.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So, for the Italian pronunciation, Cory de Simone.
De Simone.
De Simone, like abbandonato.
Sorry, Aunt Kathy.
A couple of...
You had it wrong.
Don't call my name Abandonato, please. All right, you guys. Well, thanks again for being here. I hope that you all got something out of this. If you didn't, that's your loss, man. It means you weren't listening, because I got a ton from my buddy Cory here, and I appreciate you being here. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Good.
Absolutely. So, until next time, see you later, you derelicts.